So we are now recording, and I just wanted to quickly introduce Charlie and Yuju from the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. They have a wonderful presentation for us today, and without further ado, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Let me see. All right. Do you see the whole thing or do you see notes?
Looks great. See everything, not the notes.
Not the notes. Okay. Awesome. So thanks everyone for coming during your lunch break. My name is Yuju Park. I'm the Fair Housing Senior Planner with the Neighborhood Planning Team at HPD. And I'm here with my colleague, Charlie, and a couple others. And some of you might recognize us from last week during Affordable 101. But today we'll be going deeper on fair housing and questions on housing choice. And we'll start off by telling you about what we do here at HPD, dive into the historic and current patterns of discrimination and segregation, and then go through the city's comprehensive fair housing plan, which is called Where We Live. And we'll talk a lot about that today. And then we'll end with discussing how we, including you all as the community boards, can advance fair housing here in New York City. And we'll save questions for the end, but if you have any questions as you come up, please feel free to put it in the chat and we'll go through them all together. Okay, so what is HPD? HPD stands for Housing Preservation and Development. And a little bit of what we do. We do a lot here at HPD, starting with ensuring housing quality, and we have a very large team of code enforcement officers, and they conduct inspections and issue violations, and you can see we've done quite a lot. We also work to preserve existing affordable housing while working on creating new housing. And we've preserved and created quite a lot of homes. That number can be found right there. And lastly, we engage with the community to make sure that our neighborhoods are strong and diverse. And we do this through neighborhood plans, outreach about our housing resources, and community engagement around what folks want to see on our public sites. Oh, sorry. Let me go through all those animations. All right, so just to get us started, and now that you all know who we are, we're going to start off with some icebreakers. And Charlie, if you could fill out the poll, we're going to have a couple questions, including what borough you're from, community district, and a couple other questions of why someone would choose to move to your district. What are some top issues that make it hard for people to stay in your district?
Yeah, so the poll we just launched will have 3 questions if you scroll down as you're answering them. And we'll kind of discuss why we asked the second 2 questions. And when you're done, when you've submitted an answer in the poll, we'd also love if in the chat you could say what community board you're from, using the borough abbreviation and then the number. It's a big ask up front, but then we'll do more of the talking. So we'll give everyone about a minute more to do the poll.
Are people seeing the poll? If not, it'll be on the top right, or it should have popped up. So let us know. All right, we'll give it a couple more seconds for you to fill out all your answers.
All right, so sharing the results right here. Shout out the Bronx again, most represented borough in the meeting. We appreciate you. Brooklyn and Manhattan in second place. Brooklyn's here. Queens in the building. Staten Island send their regrets, but we know they're here in spirit. So a lot of people said ease of transportation. Interestingly, 70% of you said that's kind of a big reason someone would choose to move to your district. And that's followed by family and community. So those connections are important to people. Affordability, housing options, and proximity to local businesses all came next to that. But interesting to see ease of transportation there. And then I think this was kind of predictable, but one of the issues that's really making it hard for people to stay in your district, 93% of you said housing costs are too high. but people also flagged housing quality, which I think is relevant to our conversation today. So if you haven't yet dropped your community board number in the chat, please do so. But thank you all for sharing, and we'll get going.
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks, everyone. It's great to see the spread of folks here today joining us. So we're going to move along. And so thanks for all those contributions. Those are all going to be very related to what we'll be talking about today. So today we'll be grappling through some controversial and complicated concepts, but at the heart of everything, at the heart of fair housing is really choice. And especially as New Yorkers, it can feel like choice of where to live is not entirely up to us. And for many people here in the country, where they live has never really been dictated by their own preferences. Folks mentioned, housing costs is a problem. That's one example of how it's restricted where folks live. So structural forces at all the levels, federal, state, municipal, community levels, they all severely have limited residential options, especially for people of color, for much of the 20th century, but it also promoted mobility and wealth building for white Americans in particular. So on the local level, community boards have a really important role in upholding the city's commitment to fair housing goals. So what are our fair housing goals here in New York City? The city created a comprehensive fair housing plan called Where We Live, and the plan analyzed historic and contemporary trends. And after asking New Yorkers what they thought about fair housing issues in the city, we created goals that we'll go over later in the presentation. And so first, my colleague Charlie will go over some of the fair housing history and concepts.
Thank you, Yuju. Go to the next slide. So just like the Where We Live plan breaks down some of these history and concepts that show the struggle for fair housing, we're going to see how some of these issues that were supposed to be solved by the passing of the Fair Housing Act still kind of plague us today. But let's start a little bit in the past with the next slide. So I think many here are likely familiar with redlining and the maps like the one of Brooklyn that I have on the screen. They were drawn by the Homeowners Loan Corporation during the Depression, or the Hulk, not the Hulk, the Hulk. Redlining saw the government play an outsized role in orchestrating where there would be racially concentrated areas of affluence and poverty. So if you see on the screen, the coding from best to hazardous by color. Often a neighborhood would be very similar to one with housing stock, with open space, etc. But because of who lived there, it would be deemed hazardous. So the government and banks kind of working together to basically choose where people can live. So if you, the FHA, which was the Federal Housing Administration, would basically underwrite loans that banks would give based on an area's demographic makeup. Click. So that played out in New York, that this coincided with the development of the outer boroughs and a lot of the metropolitan region. And so the federal government was basically subsidizing mortgages and housing development for whites in white areas and cutting off people of color predominantly from this kind of subsidized financing. And this is kind of the creation of the suburbs, creation of some of our low density neighborhoods in New York. So I want to keep a running list of kind of actors here. If you can just drop in the chat, who redlines, who's involved with redlining, just anyone you could think of on any scale that kind of brought this into existence. And we'll ask some of these questions as we go, right? Someone saying city planning, so the local government, all the way down to banks and realtor. Okay, I love the way you're thinking. So yes, so we're getting some good options. Let's go to the next slide. You can keep throwing them in there. We're going to ask you a little bit more who. So racism was written into government and bank underwriting, and much earlier it was written into zoning itself, but it was also written into deeds of homes and the contracts of like planned communities and developments. And so we see here the racially restrictive covenant on the top right corner of the screen that was in the contract for Levittown in Long Island. So you had to sign on to a contract that said you would not no dwelling should be used by members other than of the Caucasian race. And, the Supreme Court actually found that these covenants were unenforceable, but it didn't change the fact that the Federal Housing Administration, who made those redlining maps, and lenders, they liked covenants. They thought they were favorable. If they saw a covenant, it would be a more surefire way to get a loan from them. And many deeds to individual homes across the country still have these covenants. And I think it's important just to reiterate kind of a point you made about redlining, that if you had access to these, especially post-World War II, you were really getting a deal. Like, white homers often were presented with an opportunity not only to build generational wealth, but also to pay mortgage payments that were less than the rents that people who were still in the cities were paying. You click. So who established covenants? Who kind of has a role to play in these contracts for everything from an individual home to a large planned community? If you have any ideas, you can throw those in the chat. And you can go to the next slide while people are thinking of those. And this was not limited to places like Levittown. Multifamily housing was not immune to this type of discrimination. So here in New York, Stuyvesant Town, which was developed by the insurance company Metropolitan Life, they're under a principle that Blacks and whites do not mix. So this is something that was built with public money. It offered favorable terms, mostly to veterans. It had green space, modern amenities, stability that a lot of people didn't have in older neighborhoods, but they were not open to Black and brown New Yorkers. And residents actually sued to integrate the development. It went all the way to the New York Supreme Court, but this was before the Fair Housing Act. And so the Supreme Court said housing is not a civil right. MetLife could legally discriminate. And public housing in New York City was also segregated. So, after white flight to the suburbs, there were a lot of vacancies in formerly all white housing projects and the integrated, but we should not think of this kind of discrimination or segregation as just a suburban issue. So we don't have time today to go into all the actors and actions, but you all are getting at them in the chat. But suffice to say that discrimination was at play from the zoning ordinances that mandated like only large single family homes in certain areas, to the realtors who would steer prospective buyer of different races to completely different neighborhoods. So we were asking who, but another question could have been when in the course of housing's life cycle did discrimination take place? And I think the answer is planned, financed, built, marketed, bought, renovated, sold. Add another verb in there. Next slide. And so on the flip side of that, these attitudes from all these levels towards urban neighborhoods that have, frankly, people of color in them, is such a negative attitude that, it's not surprising they would designate them blighted. And if that meant that they could do urban renewal projects, or some would call it slum clearance. And so intact neighborhoods, often integrated neighborhoods, were destroyed to make way for priority projects for cities, such as highways, entertainment facilities, sometimes middle-class housing, but not that could be afforded by the people who were living there. And so in New York City, Robert Moses is known as an official who pulled the trigger on a lot of this, and he promised anyone displaced would be housed in new housing. But the public housing that emerged in this era never made up for those homes lost. And given what we just talked about the the limits of where people of color could live, especially because of redlining, it meant that people were dispersed, but then concentrated again in the limited areas they were able to live. For example, the construction of Lincoln Center was something that displaced 7,000 families, almost all of them Black and Hispanic, along with 800 businesses, and there was no official relocation plan. And in this picture, we actually see place where 345 buildings were destroyed just to make one section of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway in Brooklyn. Many people could not take everything in their homes with them. And so the things that they left behind were dumped into Jamaica Bay to be landfill. And so the picture you see in the lower left inset there is actually what you could see today at Dead Horse Bay in South Brooklyn. The beach is covered in what some people call trash, but it's often not trash, as the artifacts that whose homes were destroyed for urban renewal could not take with them. But New Yorkers who experienced this discrimination fought back. They were not passive, and ultimately they helped change the status quo. So here we see some flyers and artifacts from Bronx residents who fought urban renewal that ultimately brought the Cross Bronx Expressway to their neighborhood. We see Brooklynites staging sit-ins at newly built housing that was only renting to whites. And we see Stuytown residents protesting the whites-only policy in their building. And these were local channels of the larger national civil rights movement. So I think a lot of people are familiar with the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act of 1964. And that really expanded voting rights, employment opportunities. But it's important to note that housing actually was not included in the first civil rights bills in the 60s. Walter Mondale, who was trying to pass fair housing for many years, was the vice president under LBJ. He said civil rights legislation was fair housing legislation was civil rights getting personal. So other civil rights legislation, Northern Congress people could be like, yeah, that's a Southern problem. But if they were going to confront housing segregation, it would mean rewriting the rules of their own Northern neighborhoods. So Martin Luther King, actually, his first big Northern campaign was in Chicago, and it was really focused on housing, the type of Northern housing segregation, pushing for more low-income housing, but also pushing against real estate practices. And it was really only after the assassination of King that the Fair Housing Act passed. Literally, troops were stationed outside of the Capitol as people were uprising after his assassination when it got passed. So this is basically the Fair Housing Act. It outlaws discrimination in renting, buying, financing of housing. And you see these protected classes. So these are you can't discriminate on anyone in housing based on these. In New York, we actually have some additional classes. So you see here age, citizenship, sexual orientation. So again, these are not things that are protected everywhere in the country. And I want to specifically call it lawful source of income, because that includes if you receive a housing voucher, if you are on disability, any form of income. It doesn't matter here in New York, although you could be legally denied because you have a voucher somewhere else. That doesn't mean people aren't denied because they have a voucher in New York, but it's technically illegal. And then in the 80s, reasonable accommodations and modifications for people with disabilities were added to the act. So not only do people have to make accommodations or modify housing for people with disabilities, but also, certain rules that may govern housing, like a no pet policy, for example, should be waived if someone needs a service animal. So that's part of the Fair Housing Act. Okay, so that was the past. What are the fair housing issues today in New York? So if you could drop in the chat some barriers to like that vision that was laid out by the Fair Housing Act that exists today, or anything happening today that kind of echoes the segregation and discrimination that we just talked about, that we think of as a problem of the past. So I'm seeing not enough homes and the rent is too high, which is not something people always think of as a fair housing issue. But if it's a barrier to, the kind of integration that was envisioned, then yes. Single family zoning definitely is something that has been used as a quote race neutral tool. No protections for senior citizens. Yeah, these are some great ones. So we're going to keep going. You can keep throwing those in there. So yeah, I mean, some of you are pointing out that sometimes feels like not a lot has changed, and that in the most diverse city in the country, we're still very segregated, as evidenced by the distinct clusters of dots you see in various parts of the city. And as Yuju mentioned, for the Where We Live plan, we talked to over 700 New Yorkers in 15 languages about the impacts of segregation and discrimination. And so, we just saw that map, but participants stressed that they weren't always interested in integration for integration's sake, but rather pointing out that racial and ethnic segregation means that there are racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty and affluence. So this person saying it's not bad to be integrated, it's not bad to be separated, it's just bad when where you live truly means what you have access to. Click. And, you know, in fact, obviously one thing that makes New York amazing is that people with similar cultural values and social networks can create their own neighborhoods. The issue is if those neighborhoods can thrive. But of course, access to services, educational and employment opportunities are often concentrated in proximity to the affluent. So this is an example of the opportunity to access credit and services from financial institutions, banks, for many areas like South Bronx, Eastern Brooklyn, the North Shore of Staten Island. On this map, so a ratio of 10, for example, means that for every check cashier or pawn shop, there are 10 banks or credit unions. So the reddest areas have 10 pawn shops or check cashiers for every bank. And I think that's interesting because we just talked about redlining and how financial institutions neglected communities of color. So that opportunity is still not often available. And conversely, you know, noxious industries, transportation infrastructure, they were cited where disinvestment was happening and where there were few opportunities to renovate aging housing stock. So the rate of asthma, emergency room visits is on this map, is much lower in predominantly white neighborhoods. There was even an article in the New York Times today about the racial gap in pedestrian road fatalities. So more Black and brown New Yorkers are getting hit by cars because of where high-speed traffic streets are placed to get people onto highways, basically. And, you know, I think people are already saying this, but this map highlights kind of where the share of homes that are rented at prices affordable to households earning 60% of the city's area median income are. And so, you know, given just the amount of light blue to gray, it's I'd say it's a fair housing issue that so much of the city is off limits to so many people. And affordable housing would be a way to combat this inaffordability. But, you know, from our framework of thinking about choice, the concentration of new affordable housing we see on this map does not hew to the principle of expanded opportunity. So 50,000 new affordable homes constructed between 2014 and 2022, but most of them are built in the dark blue areas where there's already a lot of low-cost housing, and meanwhile, most of the cities saw little to new affordable housing. And so we talked about vouchers earlier. So a housing choice voucher like Section 8 or city FEPs, these are tools to overcome the inaffordability of New York, because the federal government and the city distribute vouchers, which means the voucher holder won't pay more than 30% of their income on rent. But what we heard from voucher holders, we see in this first quote, they try to use their voucher and they're told they can't use it, which is illegal. Or they experience the opposite of expanded housing choice, where they have to move somewhere that they don't want to move because it's the only place that will take their voucher. And this map kind of backs that up, that, you know, we're seeing kind of concentrations of where vouchers are being used, and in certain areas there's a really low percentage of voucher uptake. And even in expensive New York, we have something called exemption payment standards, which means that the government will actually pay even more in your rent and the highest rent zip codes. So you could use vouchers in pretty much all of New York City, but we're seeing it's not happening. And it's the #1 form of housing discrimination, according to the Commission on Human Rights that we have in the city. And I just want to say people told similar stories about disability status. So here's a quote from someone who was denied access to housing because a landlord saw their disability. And also examples of homes not being modified to accommodate people's disabilities. Most of these things are mandated in the Fair Housing Act. I'll turn it back over to you, Ju.
Thanks, Charlie. So far we've discussed the ways in which the Fair Housing Act provides legal mechanisms to combat and prevent discrimination. But the Fair Housing Act also includes a provision that recipients of HUD funds affirmatively take action to overcome patterns of segregation. So what does that mean? It means that HUD and local governments are obligated to expand housing choices in integrated areas and areas with access to opportunity. So this means neighborhoods with good schools, clean air, access to good transportation, high quality housing types. It also means simultaneously investing in neighborhoods to increase opportunities there. So from the time the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968 to 1994, AFFH had no real guidelines, and that's a really long time. And that changed in 1994, as you can see over here in the very beginning when President Clinton issued an executive order to create such guidelines. And in 2015, President Obama issued a final rule for AFFH, which provided more guidance and support for local governments around the country to conduct a more inclusive, comprehensive planning process to affirmatively further fair housing. And they did this by creating tools and standards for analysis and community engagement. And for the very first time, there were actually consequences if local governments didn't follow through. In 2020, President Trump repealed AFFH back when he was on Twitter. Now he's no longer. We see him tweeting about how AFFH harms the suburban lifestyle and how building low-income housing lowers property values and increases crime. And then if we fast forward to 2023, the Biden administration put out a proposal to reinstate the 2015 rule. And this is important because HUD won't give you a community development block grant if you're not in compliance with AFFH. And that funding is a lot of what communities rely on to fund a lot of their projects. So how do we see AFFH playing out in states? This is from 2009. There was a lawsuit alleging that Westchester County in New York had accepted over $52 million in HUD funding over the years. And that was under the false assertion that they were building housing that was affordable to protected classes in majority white communities. HUD mandated Westchester County to build affordable housing in the areas shaded blue, which are predominantly white and single family zoned. You see on the map on the right, most of the map is blue. So plenty of places to build affordable housing in these higher opportunity areas. And that shouldn't be a problem, theoretically. But this is the city of Rye. And that shows up at blue on the previous map that we saw. And they were tasked with building affordable housing in its community. So they choose a lot to build affordable housing, except it's on the edge of the city of Rye bordering Port Chester, which is 28% white and not labeled blue on the map I showed earlier, which means affordable housing can't go there. And yet the city of Rye chooses to build affordable housing that's separated from the rest of the city by 2 interstate highways. And they effectively bar the residents of this proposed housing, affordable housing, to access the rest of the high opportunity areas in the city of Rye. And this is really an example of how Westchester went against the spirit of AFFH and creating opportunity. And it also demonstrates how hard it is to get these enforcement tools right, and how important it is for communities to be brought into the principles of AFFH. So if you could put in the chat, who decides where housing gets built? And folks can put that in the chat. And while people put that in the chat, we'll continue. So regardless of the president in office, New York City has always taken the AFFH obligation seriously, and we went ahead with the analysis and actions consistent with Obama's final rule. And that's where the Where We Live plan comes from, which we'll talk about next. And we also wanted to highlight the balanced approach the AFFH rule calls for. This is a scale, as you can see. The AFFH rule makes it really clear that increasing access to historically exclusive neighborhoods is really fundamental to reversing patterns of segregation and disparities and access to opportunity that the anti-discrimination components of FHA, the Fair Housing Act, did not change. But there's equal importance in place-based strategies. So many people don't want to leave their communities that they love. It's near family, it's near transit, it's near schools. Investments and social services in lower opportunity neighborhoods is just as important. So we really wanted to highlight this balanced approach for AFFH. So part of affirmatively furthering fair housing, a little bit of a mouthful, means local governments have to analyze present conditions, look at barriers to fair housing, and then propose solutions. And that's where the Where We Live plan, the city's fair housing plan, really sought to do. Okay, so Where We Live has 6 specific goals, which we'll go over next. And the plan includes 81 commitments that the city will do. And we had 81 commitments, and currently 86% are complete or in progress. So the city is really making a big effort to address these issues of discrimination and create more opportunity for people to choose where they want to live. And so we'll go over some of the highlights and commitments that have been completed and still in progress. But if you'd like to learn more, we just released a progress report for Where We Live. And it details a lot of the information on every single one of the 81 commitments. So you can find more information there. And these are just the 6 goals. We'll be going over these individually, but just wanted to highlight that these goals are using a really balanced approach of making sure that we're creating more housing, but also continuing to invest in our neighborhoods. And we also wanted to highlight that the goals of Where We Live closely align with the goals in the mayor's housing blueprint. That's a separate document that the mayor's office put out, and just wanted to show that his vision is also very much aligned with our fair housing plan. So this is goal 1 for Where We Live, and it's to combat persistent, complex discrimination for New Yorkers. And we've already completed 1 commitment in this area, and that's by including new resources for enforcement, education, support for subsidy holders. And we're still in the process of completing other commitments. So that include supporting local legislation to address discrimination against residents who have had past involvement with the criminal justice system, publishing legal enforcement guidance for discrimination by co-op associations, expanding investigations to identify illegal discrimination. So lots of things. Goal 2 is to facilitate equitable housing development. And we talk about this a lot around here in the city, especially because housing is so expensive. And some highlights of commitments that have already been done include rezonings of Gowanus and Soho, if those sound familiar to you. And those are 2 really low affordability areas with lots of amenities. And we've also worked on increasing down payment assistance for low-income home buyers to $100,000. And I believe that used to be 50,000. So increase that so people could have more opportunity to build wealth. In progress, we have a lot of work, and that includes there's something called zoning for housing opportunity, and that's the mayor's proposed zoning amendment to encourage the creation of more housing in neighborhoods across the city. And on that vein, we have goal 3, which is to preserve affordable housing and prevent displacement. Part of that work that's been completed and is still ongoing includes completing renovations on NYCHA units, expanding anti-displacement initiatives citywide that have previously been in pilot phases. And just wanted to highlight 2 specific programs. Partners in Preservation is an anti-harassment and displacement program. They work with tenants and community organizations, and the Homeowner Help Desk assists homeowners with housing issues, and they connect them to legal and financial services if they need them. And we acknowledge there's definitely still a lot of work to be done with continuing to improve and rehabilitate NYCHA's housing, and also expanding programs to homeowners and property owners to preserve their homes. And goal 4 is to enable more effective rental assistance benefits. So as Charlie showed with what we heard from New Yorkers, we heard a lot about source of income discrimination where landlords refuse to take vouchers. And we've done some work already by investing in housing mobility counseling for voucher holders, also increasing HPD financed units for homeless households. And we're also still working on continuing to expand these resources to address voucher discrimination that really evaluate initiatives that best help voucher holders. We heard about disability discrimination, as we heard earlier through Charlie. And so we have goal 5, which is to improve housing options for people with disabilities. And we've expanded HPD's Housing Ambassadors program, and that helps New Yorkers with disabilities apply for affordable housing through Housing Connect. That's our lottery program. And we're also still working on expanding existing programs to allow residents to obtain modifications to their homes if they need it, to accommodate for their physical needs. And we're at our very last goal, which is to make equitable investments in neighborhoods to really help people stay in place if that's what they choose, if they don't want to move. And HPD and DCP, we have a tool called the Equitable Development Data Explorer, and that's a new it's a new public data tool that you all could also use. And that reports indicators of demographic, housing, neighborhood conditions. And for the first time, that data is reported by race and ethnicity. We also began implementing the Brownsville Neighborhood Plan in Brooklyn. So that not only plans for more affordable housing, but it also invests in parks, pedestrian safety improvements, expanded activities for kids, young adults, more access to fresh foods, and more opportunities for local jobs. And HPD has been working on developing new neighborhood plans, just like we did in Brownsville. And we've also accelerated opportunities for community-owned or shared equity housing. And we've also been working on, thinking about why people choose to move to places that they like. And so often it's not just housing, it's also proximity to transit, grocery stores, like we mentioned, places to eat, banks or credit unions, that was mentioned earlier, somewhere with fresh and clean air. There are certain places in the city that's higher in asthma rates, making sure that it's easy to get to school or work. And so these are some of the commitments in progress. So that's, renovating these spaces on NYCHA campuses, making sure that there's better bus service, and making sure that renters are able to build their credit. So we just wanted to highlight all of these and, make you consider what other things and what other factors make a neighborhood. And, this can't be done by housing alone. It requires a lot of interagency work. So a lot of our partners are involved in these activities. And I think I will give it to Charlie.
Yeah, you can head to the next slide.
Yeah.
So yeah, in conclusion, Yuju really touched on these polls, 2 polls of where New Yorkers can choose to live and what their neighborhoods have, if they need to thrive. And so as the most local form of government, we are excited to be talking to community boards because we see community boards as essential to a fair housing vision of the city. And as has come up a little bit in the chat, the interaction has not always been great for community boards and the city. But we include you in the city, in this plan, in this vision. If you go to the next slide. And that's because of what community boards do to further fair housing. So for example, you click, you advocate for investments in your community, through the district needs assessment, for example. And those are, that can directly hit on our fair housing goals. Next point. You weigh on land use changes through the ULERP process. And, we see that that's an essential part of any equitable development that will happen. The community board has to be involved. And you're educating and involving your neighborhoods in policy discussions. Next. So, getting even more of your neighbors involved in this process. And then lastly, you connect your neighbors to resources, information. We have some resources about combating discrimination. You are the people that people will come to for things like that. Next slide. So this is just the beginning of a process. I think we've mentioned some initiatives that have involved the community boards in the past, but this we're kind of just trying to get out there and talk to boards about fair housing and fair housing in your community. And it's not tied to any project we're doing. It's really actually a commitment of Where We Live is to talk more about our fair housing commitments with city stakeholders, land use stakeholders like community boards. AFFH is affirmatively furthering fair housing. So it's the premise that fair housing is not just about calling out explicit discrimination, but actually disrupting patterns in the city. So I think community boards are a part of, as we've just shown, so many of those things. So we'd love to reach out and connect with you. I'll put my contact info here about having a more specific conversation with your board. We were touching on some very citywide issues, but obviously fair housing issues look very different in different neighborhoods. So we'll be kind of look out for information about that. But we would go, sorry, just looking at something. So yeah, and also going back to if we go back to the fair housing, the community board slide, I just want to think about in the chat, if anyone thinks of something we've missed, something that you do as a community board member that furthers fair housing goals that we didn't put on there, because you know, we want to be acknowledging all the ways that you're our partners in this. So yeah, Yuju, can you just go back to the coming soon slide? So we'll be doing our Affordable Housing 101 again next week in the evening. Please RSVP for that if you didn't make it to that one. And we'll be doing this training again on May 9th in the evening as well. So I am going to, this is my contact information. I'll also put it in the chat. We would love to further the conversation with your board. I actually have to hop off to go to another training, but I have two other colleagues here, Sarit and Renee, who are our director and deputy director of neighborhood planning, and them and Yuju are going to stick around for the Q&A. So thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Great. Steve, I know you have your hand raised. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, and thanks for the presentation. It was really informative. I learned some things in there that I didn't know. I guess my question is, I know the presentation focused on affordable and fair housing. I guess I just anecdotally, based on, you know, where I live in central Brooklyn, my concern is that there just aren't enough new housing units being created since COVID. That's in terms of total units, so including market rate units. So I'm just curious if, you know, there's been any data showing year by year housing construction in NYC, and to what degree construction projects have slowed and units aren't getting built over the last few years once COVID happened.
Yeah, Sarit, would you like to take that?
Sure. So, you know, great question, Steve. We obviously, you know, as you saw in the Where We Live plan, you know, facilitating housing development is a key goal of advancing fair housing citywide, just creating housing choice and opportunities. I think, you know, actually in the presentation that we shared, we did have some information showing sort of the distribution of housing production across the city, where you can really see some of the unevenness across the city and get a better sense of where, you know, the most of the affordable housing that's being constructed really is centered in areas that already has a large amount of affordable housing. I think these, when we're thinking about some of these trends, these are the things that kind of are really critical for us to be thinking about from an affordable housing perspective. And, you know, your point about just kind of like the last few years specifically, that's something that we do have data on too. Most of our data that I think we shared in this deck was kind of a bit before that, but that's, you know, that's something that we can also share and also recommend, tell you kind of where you can find that information too. But I would say that overall, you know, that is on our minds as like a key goal, and, you know, how we're approaching this work and conversations with you all. It's a focus.
Thanks,
I think we're going to be dropping in a couple links into the chat where you can find more information about kind of housing construction trends across the city. Thanks, Renee.
Thank you both. Elizabeth?
Hi, it sometimes seems like a lot of the ways to creating new housing involve like a lot of different, you know, there's a lot of procedure, and I think it's great that there's a lot of outreach to communities to make sure that the needs of the communities are being met. But, you know, I'm thinking, especially in our role as CBs, you know, one of the things that we've seen in the last 2 years is a lot of information about how maybe CBs aren't as representative of the districts that they represent, but especially of the people who are most affected by the lack of fair housing and the lack of affordable housing and so forth. And so I was wondering if there was like any advice or thoughts that HPD might have on how, you know, a group that maybe is disproportionately likely to own their home or be more secure in their housing can approach you know, when new housing proposals and so forth are brought in front of them, to make sure that we're working as a point that is helping to further these goals, to make sure that fair housing and secure housing is available to everyone, instead of, you know, accidentally kind of or maybe not accidentally, preventing that from being created and provided to those who need it the most.
All right. Well, Yuju, did you want to take that?
No. I was gonna, it's all
Okay.
good. Yeah.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for that question. That, really kind of hits the nail on the head on like why we are having this conversation with you all today. You are so integral and so central to the outcomes of some of the kind of major land use decisions that happen in communities across New York City. And, your point about kind of really thinking about like who is making these decisions and kind of representation across community boards is obviously a factor. We, are doing this training today coming out of a Where We Live commitment to educate land use stakeholders in kind of across the ULURP process about the implications of these decisions. I think that is one way that we are hoping to contribute. And, we would really want to partner with all of you so that we can come to your community boards to talk with the members. So I think education is one component. Obviously thinking, there are, I think what you're bringing up is like kind of like a bigger picture question of just like how folks get appointed, which is a bit of out of HPD's wheelhouse. But I think for the folks who are on community boards today, we really want to partner with you to make sure that people are getting the right information about the implications of their decisions. And hopefully the type of presentation we've done today is the kind of thing that can kind of help expand people's knowledge around that. I think Charlie mentioned as well that we would want to come out and do something that's a little more tailored to community boards. So in a scenario where we would, come out to you all, we'd actually want to bring specific kind of scenarios or examples of, what it looks like when, a certain type of affordable housing development is being proposed in a community. Kind of what are the questions that we should be asking when that gets proposed in a neighborhood? Kind of what are some of the lenses or ideas that we can bring to the conversation? Like we want to give folks specific tools to be kind of asking themselves. So that's a little bit of the next step for us that we'd love to work on with all of you.
Thank you. A lot of hands. Esther, if you'd like to go next.
I didn't know I was next. I just want to say the discussion, every time I hear the word affordable housing, I cringe because there's nothing affordable about the houses that's going up now. I see housing being built all over this city, yet the whole homeless rate is growing. Anytime you build a housing, there's 60% and 80% of AMI. Nobody can afford it. I have people in my home that's making $40,000 a year. They can't. I mean, it's ridiculous. So I don't know what affordable means, but it's not what they're building. And even when they have some affordable units, forget 30% AMI. That's something that was like a dinosaur. It'll be like if you build 100 units, they may have 5 that's real affordable out the whole building. So until we get the federal government to change the AMI, it's nothing to talk about with affordable housing. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, thanks, Esther, for that. And we definitely understand your concern, and it's something that we hear quite often. I don't know if you were at our Affordable Housing 101 last week, and we'll be giving one again next week in the evening, I believe. But HPD, we build 100% affordable housing. And if you do see anything a lot more expensive, that's above 100% AMI, those are usually not 100% affordable through HPD. So just wanted to highlight that, but definitely hear your concern. Samir?
Yeah, so I know that the Speaker Adams, has a report that has a fair housing framework potentially in there with targets for each community district, including that will take into account things like transit, parks, jobs, et cetera. How is HPD engaging with that? And do you expect if something like that goes through for your engagement with community boards to change, considering it will be more of a like, how do we get the units done instead of do we want the units at all?
Suri, you want to take that one?
Sure. So sorry, I think I lost literally the first part of what you said. Were you talking, which targets were you talking about specifically?
The proposal in the Speaker's report for the,
Yeah.
I think it's like housing over people or housing
Yep.
over or something.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to what is being proposed in terms of thinking really about kind of neighborhood specific targets, that obviously echoes some of what was proposed in the state level housing compact, which, as folks are likely aware, has very much kind of fallen apart in the last couple of weeks. So, there was this kind of mirroring of kind of state and city policies that at this point there isn't like as much of a clear path for on the state level. I think on the city level, we also have some, there are some challenges there. I think there's, as I mentioned up front when I was talking about the distribution of where affordable housing has been built across the city, I think we at HPD do think there's a lot of value in thinking about all of the ways that we can ensure that we are, all of the various tools and how we can ensure that affordable housing production is getting distributed across the city. This could be one tool. It could be challenging to implement. Most of these types of policies, when we see them in other states like Massachusetts and California, really are at the state level. The kind of like enforcement tools at the city level are something that like we just would need to think more about what would be possible on the city level without kind of a state level apparatus, or in many of the other places where this exists, there are also comprehensive plans that are backing this up. So without
down the ramp, you're gonna make a right and you're gonna go to the 4th floor.
Can someone mute? So yeah, just want to state that, the way this has worked elsewhere has been a part of like a much larger network of policies.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Suri. Beverly? Beverly,
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Very great presentation, a lot of good information. In regards to HPD, which I don't know right now, what is their numbers on how much of city-owned lots or sites that they have. But, and in regards to affordability, I think that sometimes y'all give too much to the real estate partners that y'all deal with. And if y'all have sites that y'all giving up for $1 and these sites are not affordable to the people in the area, you're defeating the purpose. Like one person said, you have all these programs, but still homelessness is still going up. Maybe think about having a policy where if it's a city-owned project or city-owned lot of site, that the amount of rent that can be paid is 30% of anybody's income, giving more flexibility for more people to afford it. Because like one person said, you're going by the AMI of HUD, which changes every year and it only increases. So the people who was paying was 80% of the AMI, $100,000, maybe some years back, that's now probably 60% of the AMI now because it goes up every year. I also think that sometimes when you have projects that go into construction, that the year that it goes in, that if you're going to use the AMI, that it stays to that AMI until completion, because I see that sometimes what happens is that once, if you started a project in 2017 or whatever, and it takes about 3 years to be finished, the AMI changes, and then y'all go by that AMI of that current rate. You don't keep it at the AMI when the projects do start. It's just some ideas I think should be considered. And I also think that a lot of if we have a monitoring agency that includes the people of the community, I think sometimes y'all don't take in consideration that the people of the community who's been living these type of hardships for affordable housing don't have the know-how or the finesse to be part of the decisions of the type of housing that comes into the community.
Thank you. Thank you, Beverly. Really appreciate your thoughts. And Yeah, definitely we'll take those into consideration. I know we're running out of time, and Melissa, I know you've had your hand raised for a while, so I think that'll be our last question.
Thank you. Thank you for all of this today. This has been great. I was just wondering, I know for myself, I served on a community board in Flatbush, Brooklyn, and I commuted for a good while up to Upper East Side in Yorkville, and these are obviously two very different neighborhoods. And where I live, it's a lot of rent stabilized apartments and lower income buildings, neighborhood that's been around for a good while. And where I was working, it's a lot of construction at the time. And this is pretty recently, but construction that they were taking out a lot of lower income buildings, demolishing entire blocks and putting up luxury buildings where people would then be buying the entire floor. And it was actually reducing the living space. So they would be taking out several 3 or 4 story buildings on the block, taking out a lot of apartments and putting in one large building that would have fewer residents. So it was reducing the number of livable apartments in the city. And I was actually wondering, just with the city's growing need for both shelters, with our right to shelter, and affordable housing that we have, how are HPD and DHS, for that matter, really approaching satisfying competing neighborhoods and community districts' different desires? With like Flatbush and Yorkville, for example, obviously we all have our own desires and needs. Nobody, I think, really wants to have shelters in our neighborhoods, but I think that some automatically do get to have more than others. But we also, I think, our needs and desires, they often mirror our constituents' very different economic and social capital, and say. So between the Get Stuff Built and Where We Live reports that have recently come out, I think that there's a lot in there. But it's a tough call too, and just anything you could say to that, I would love to hear.
Melissa, thank you so much for that question. I think, this too is so central to the work that we're doing and the presentation that we shared today. So kind of appreciate you kind of bringing that to kind of the local level where you're seeing some of these issues really play out. When it comes to thinking about where kind of, well, first of all, like preserving affordable housing is a high priority for us. So kind of, hearing about the affordable housing that is being kind of replaced by housing that is not affordable in certain parts of the city is something that we kind of have a large set of policies and programs that we try to address and kind of work in those neighborhoods around. I think too, when it comes to your question around like shelters and where those get cited, and community opposition, I really feel like this kind of comes back down to some of what we've been talking about here today, is trying to kind of educate folks around the potential implications of their actions, and trying to ensure that there is kind of fair share, and citing, affordable housing as well as kind of shelters are really kind of distributed across the city evenly.
Thanks, Suri. And I know we are over time. And I see, Stephen, you're about to say something. I'll give you the last word.
Thank you. Yes, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. And thank you to HPD for this wonderful workshop. I also just really wanted to flag for everyone who's still here that beginning on May 10th, participatory budgeting is going to go live. It's the first citywide program. Keep an eye out for communications from the Civic Engagement Commission about that. There are many ways for you to get involved in participatory budgeting. So we would be really excited to see how we can all work together to really bring a wonderful participatory budgeting vote period from May through June. So again, that begins on May 10th. And thank you all for joining us. I'm going to end the recording now and release you all back to your days. Hopefully you get outside and enjoy the sunshine. And thanks again. And thanks again to Yuju and Charlie for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you all. Have a great day.